as well.
I thank the member for Oxley. The question is that the amendment to the proposed amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Durack.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise today to speak on the Fair Work Amendment Corrupting Benefits Bill. This bill will make it unlawful for unions to take payments from companies who sell out their workers. Deputy Speaker, in my past life I was a lawyer. One would say I'm still a lawyer, still pay my fees. When you pay a lawyer to represent you, you trust that they will represent you fairly. You trust that they will not take payments from both parties in a dispute during negotiations because you've paid your money to them to represent you. This is not a difficult concept to understand. It is in fact very, very simple, Mr Deputy Speaker. Yet somehow those members opposite and their union bosses still appear to have difficulty wrapping their heads around this very simple concept. Mr Deputy Speaker, research agency Roy Morgan released a report at the start of the year that estimates that some 15 to 17% of the Australian workforce is now a member of a union. This is a record low. And yet, Mr Deputy Speaker, at least 50% of the Labor Party's candidates are chosen by the unions. This defies to belief. How can you run 50% of your candidates in an election with ties to a movement that only represents 50% of the population? The maths of that equation do not stand up to scrutiny, Mr Deputy Speaker. And we must ask ourselves, why is it that the Australian public, educated, hard-working, some entrepreneurial, some not, that they are, have abandoned the union movement? And I think it's simple, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Australian people do not enjoy being lectured to by the hypocrites, and that is exactly what the modern union movement and its political arm in the Labor Party seek to do. Mr Deputy Speaker, time and time again, unions have eroded the trust that workers have placed in them because of the secret payments, the militant behaviour and the perception that they no longer care about the average Australian worker. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, this does stand up to scrutiny. Unions do not represent the lowest paid workers in this country. Not anymore. Not anymore, Mr Deputy Speaker. In fact, they are barely representative of the construction sector. They no longer enjoy the support of public opinion, and they are overly represented by bureaucrats in the public sector. Mr Deputy Speaker, the largest percentage of union membership is made up of workers earning somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000, well above the national average. These are hardly the struggling battlers the unions fraudulently claim to represent. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is the great falsehood of the union movement and the Labor Party by its very extension. They claim to be representing the lowest paid workers in our country. They claim to be fighting for a fairer deal for Australia's most disadvantaged, but they are routinely selling out their own members. And this is what this bill is all about today that we are debating. It is theft from the most vulnerable people in this country, exploitation of their hopes and fears, theft from Australians who can least afford to pay union fees, in fact many of whom, Mr Deputy Speaker, have no choice whether they pay these fees or not. Such is the nature of the modern-day union movement, and it is shameful. And it is truly sickening that the Labor Party have the gall to stand in this House and pretend, Deputy Speaker, to stand up for the lowest-paid workers in this country, and criticise this government when they have long ago abandoned any credibility on this issue, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Hayden Royal Commission uncovered a raft of payments between unions and employers that were designed to ensure that some companies, not all companies, but just some companies, some really special companies, that were given special treatment to ensure that they did not become a target for militant union industrial action. This is blatant, gun-to-the-head type negotiations, Mr Deputy Speaker. And the flow-on effects of this to the Australian economy are real and they are measurable, Mr Deputy Speaker. And a good example of this, according to the Master Builders Association of Queensland, is that union activity can add up to an extra 30% of the cost of building a house. Mr Deputy Speaker, I think one of the most disturbing developments from the Hayden Royal Commission was the payments made to the AWU Victoria, the member for Maribyrnong and the leader of the opposition's very own union. This is the man who's styling himself as the alternative leader of the country, leading those opposite, as the man who will represent Australia on the world stage, as the man who has orchestrated the taking of secret payments from organisations like Clean Event and sold out the workers he claims to represent. These are the people who are very hard-working and their working conditions are extreme. Thankfully, we've introduced this legislation to ban these secret payments between business and unions and requiring disclosure of any legitimate payments. This is a simple and efficient measure, Mr Deputy Speaker, as recommended by the Hayden Royal Commission, to make unions more accountable and more accessible. Mr Deputy Speaker, it truly is disturbing that these corrupting benefits, as the Hayden Commission called them, have been identified in successive Royal Commissions into union activity since 1982. And I take it from the previous speaker, yeah, well, perhaps we should have done something early, and I accept that. But thankfully, we are doing something now, and it's good to see the Labor Party are considering joining forces with us. This simply reinforces the fact that unions are out of touch and no longer represent the members who pay their fees. They have long ago abandoned these workers and are solely looking out to feather their own nests. As we've heard time and time again, more recently in this House, they have more in common with the big end of town than what we do, and more in common with the big employers. In fact, we may actually be doing those opposite a favour with respect to this legislation, Mr Deputy Speaker, because this could very well restore some faith in the union movement as the doors are flung open, and let's hope the cobwebs are swept out. And as we've heard from those members opposite, clearly included in their talking points for this particular debate, we've thrown in the discussion around targeting workers and the lowest paid in our society through cuts to penalty rates. I mean, really, if you really cared about the lowest paid workers in this country, you would have done something yourselves about what we're discussing here today. It is truly amazing the length and breadth of the hypocrisy from those opposite on workplace relations, Mr Deputy Speaker. It really is stunning. The Leader of the Opposition sets up a Fair Work Commission, puts his mates on it, to investigate penalty rates in this country. He says time and time again, together with the other leaders on the other side, that he will respect its decision. The problem was, Mr Deputy Speaker, it was the wrong decision, so therefore it couldn't be supported. I mean, come on, give us a break. It hands down its decision and suddenly it's the coalition attacking workers. The hypocrisy is just unbelievable. Well, I do have some news for those opposite. You don't represent workers anymore. I see it time and time again. You don't represent the public of Australia anymore. You are out of touch and bordering on irrelevant. My dear granddad, a man called David Deller, he was a WA state Labor politician in the 1960s, a very good man, worked hard, represented the people who really needed good representation. He would be ashamed of what the Labor Party has become today. Mr Deputy Speaker, to avoid accusations of attacking workers from those opposite, let me assure you that in this bill the measure applies equal punishment to the companies and employers who agree to a backroom deal with the union as the union boss who makes the deal. And as we know, Mr Deputy Speaker, it does take two to tango, and we plan on ensuring corruption is stamped out at all levels, because we know that corruption and productivity and performance cannot coexist. And I think we on this side, we know that the Australian public deserves no less, and that's why we're introducing this bill. This measure will help instil some faith back into the union movement, which has been shaken by scandal after scandal and has hopelessly lost its way. We know 50% of those opposite will agree and possibly 50% of those opposite will not agree. But I do encourage those members opposite to support this bill and support those lowest paid workers who they claim to represent. They haven't done so in many years, but it's never too late to start. I commend this bill to the House.
I thank the member for